Okay, so today's lecture is going to be on visual stealth. So as always, let's get an overview of the topic. So this lecture will go over how to avoid detection by sight by winning the battle of sensory processing. So in the last lecture, I went over audio stealth, and I went over hearing, noticing, and identifying. Well, that theme is going to be consistent here. And then I realized, well, that theme is actually consistent amongst all senses, all five senses. So in the future, the lectures will actually just focus more on the sensory processing and not just any one particular sense. But today I'm going to cover sight. There are three levels of sensory processing, and this lecture will cover how to manipulate them to your advantage. So the levels of sensory processing are receiving, or seeing specifically today, right? You look at something, the light enters your eyes, it goes into your visual cortex, and you process the image. Noticing, right? Again, if there's 100 objects in a room and you just do a quick pan across the room, you see all 100 objects, right? All 100 objects were seen, right? But if somebody was to quiz you an hour later randomly and say, hey, there were 100 objects in that room, can you tell me what those 100 objects were, right? You're only going to remember the ones that you noticed and identified, right? So you saw all 100 objects, but you only noticed and identified, or maybe you noticed 40 of them, right? You're like, that thing, there was that thing on the counter. I just, what was it, right? You noticed it kind of stuck out, but you just didn't see it enough to identify it, right? And then of course there's identifying, right? Well, there's a wine bottle, there was a sign, there was a clock, right? So again, you saw all 100, but you can only notice some of those and even identify even less of them, right? So this is what's important, how we manipulate it is, even if you're trying to sneak past somebody, even if they see you clear as day, do you stand out enough to be noticed? And even if they noticed you, did they identify you, right? But in order for you to be detected, all three must be present. Okay, so let's talk about seeing. Seeing or receiving a visual stimuli is the first step of sensory processing. There's two methods of stopping yourself from being seen. So obscurement is one we're going to talk about. That's basically having a barrier between you and the person or object, like a camera or animal looking for you, to where, right, there's an object preventing the light traveling off you, traveling to their eyes. And then avoidance. So there's going to be real no breakdown here. This is kind of a no-brainer. Wasn't going to put it in the lecture originally, but it's like if I was giving a course on advanced firefighting and then I spent a whole slide saying, remember to bring a gun and remember to bring ammo. It's kind of like, well, duh. But you do need to, mention it. But yeah, avoidance is pretty obvious, right? Best way to avoid a camera is to not walk in front of its field of vision. The best way to not be seen is to not walk in front of somebody or an animal's field of vision. Right, but the problem is you're standing in the middle of the field and you're walking up behind someone, right? If they just got a weird hair up their ass to turn around randomly, you've been seen, noticed, and identified. So how can we avoid that more efficiently? I'm going to break down obscurement. So obscurement is avoiding visual detection by placing a barrier between your effective body and the party you're concealing yourself from, fully or partially. So this term effective body, what does that mean? Well, let's say I'm driving a tank and I want to hide that tank from the enemy behind a building. Right, my body is concealed by the tank, right? But I'm driving the tank, and the tank is part of what I want to conceal, right? If I'm parked behind the building and the barrel is sticking out, for my enemy to see, notice, and identify, I've been detected, even though my physical body hasn't been detected, right? So same thing with the squad, right? If there's a 7-man squad and enemies walking by, 6 of us get behind bushes, and one dope just kind of wasn't paying attention and got seen. Right, the whole squad has been exposed. Right, if the enemy knows anything, they know that an infantryman, a rifleman doesn't just travel alone. They've got squad mates with them. Right, so the effective body is just the entire body of whatever you're trying to conceal. Right, if I'm flying a drone and I don't want the drone to be seen, even though I'm 1,000 miles away, right, the drone, I'm trying to sneak that drone past buildings. I've still been detected. Right, that's the effective body I'm trying to conceal. So just technical nerd fucking terms. And then of course, fully or partially, so we're gonna break that down. So two types of obscurement: complete obscurement, partial obscurement. I'm gonna break those down further in the next few slides. So complete obscurement. So complete obscurement is concealing your entire effective body from sight, denying your opposition the opportunity to notice or identify you by hiding behind cover, right? So again, right, seeing, noticing, identifying. If you don't see something, if you physically cannot absorb the light coming off of it into your eyes, there is no noticing or there's nothing to notice or identify, right? So you're denying the whole process from the get-go, right? But cover, this cover right here, I'll break that down in a second. So practical applications. So it's actually fairly impractical for most stealth applications, but nearly mandatory for countering technology. So why do I say it's impractical for most stealth applications? This also goes back to cover, right? If you're familiar with cover and concealment, right? When you're behind cover, cover is something that will stop around, right? The thing about cover though is even if you're close to it and your enemy's out there, it's technically cover for both of you, right? Their bullets can't go through and hit you, but you don't have magic powers to see and shoot through the cover and hit them, right? You have to expose yourself at least partially to the dangers of their gunfire to come out and shoot them from cover, right? Cover is about covering more of your body than theirs, but you do have to put yourself in danger to shoot, right? So when you're behind cover, they can't hit you, but you can't hit them either. So it's the same thing with sight. And then, right, if I'm hiding behind a wall that has no gaps in it for any light to escape, they can't see me. But can I see them through the wall? No, I can't, right? So now, because again, we're talking about using sensory processing to your advantage. Well, if they can't see me and I can't see them, neither one of us has the advantage, right? And the danger of full obscurement, right? You know, I see a guy over there and I hide behind a wall, right? I have to rely on my other senses or I have to guess, right? If I peek behind that wall and they happen to be looking that direction, they're gonna see, notice, and identify my head poking out, now I'm busted. Where if I'm hiding behind a bush or partial obscurement, which is what I'll talk about later, right? If I'm looking through a hole in a bush that I'm close to, I can see them from 100 feet away. They're looking back at me, they can't see me at all. There's not enough information. Even though light from me is traveling to their eyes, it's not enough for them to notice and identify, right? So again, that's where it gets dangerous, is because when you're fully obscured, so is the enemy. So is whatever you're trying to hide from, which means your next move from that full obscurement is a guess. And when you're guessing, you're never an advantage. I can't think of one time in life when you're guessing and you're at an advantage, right? If you have to guess, you're usually at a disadvantage or at least a stalemate. However, we have technology now, right? Back in the caveman days, yes, you don't want to use complete obscurement, you want to use partial obscurement. However, we have amazing technology now. The biggest one is IR, infrared, right? That can see thermal imaging. So if I'm hiding behind a bush, right, even though a human, right, seeing parts of my shirt and pants and face and whatnot, that might not be enough for the naked eye to notice, right? If they're looking through a thermal scope, my heat signature is going to travel between those, it's going to be clear as day between those bushes, and they're going to notice, hey, there's something behind those bushes. May not identify me yet, but they're going to notice it. Or a big one is cameras, right? There's, you know, high resolution cameras. So if I'm hiding behind a bush and a camera pans over me, right, if the live operator, the live operator watching that camera might not notice me while they're watching it, right? But let's say whenever I steal something and I get away, right, as they review the footage, right, they look at that bush enough and they, you know, right, they have unlimited times basically to review that footage, and somebody might notice, hey, we'll zoom in, you know, okay, there we go, right? They were wearing a white shirt, and again, it's probably not going to be enough information to have me identified later, right? But again, with the camera, once that image has been stored, it can be rebroken down, right? If I'm hiding and a little bit of my boots sticking out, right, naked eye might miss that, but a camera won't. So again, for IR and for cameras, you want to be fully obscured to, you know, stop yourself from being identified and noticed later. Or again, a big one with IR is cover, right? So again, cover and concealment. Concealment stops the shooter from seeing you, cover stops around, right? It's thick. So if I'm standing behind like a black sheet hanging on a drawing line and, you know, I'm not backlit, which I'll talk about later, right? A human may not be able to see that, but that thin sheet is probably not going to conceal my heat signature. It may or may not, right? So if they're looking at thermal, my heat signature silhouette might still show through that sheet. right? So it's gonna need to be something thick enough to stop IR from seeing it. I don't think we have X-ray technology yet. But yeah, between cameras and IR technology, you are gonna wanna be behind full obscurement from those so that they can't break down the high resolution image later and detect you later, or if it's IR, right, it's gonna be able to detect you if you're behind something thin or you're partially obscured. So that's something to remember. It's good for technology, but for average applications, it's not. Okay, partial obscurement, pretty much went over it, right? Partial obscurement is concealing enough of your effective body that the amount seen is inadequate to be noticed and therefore identified. Practical applications, again, right? Superior obscurement for naked stealth, right? If it's just you with your bare eyes sneaking past somebody else with their naked eyes, right? Partial obscurement's better, right? If there's a wall or a thick bush, you know, obviously you don't want like some thin bush where your legs are fully exposed, right? But a thick bush, right? You choose the bush because again, if you can find a crack in those leaves, or even you can make a small one, you can see your enemy fully, right? You can see, notice, and identify them completely, and they might be able to see you, right? A little bit of light traveling their way, but they can't notice you, right? So you're dominating the sensory processing battle here, where if I'm behind the wall, it's a stalemate. They can't see me, I can't see them, you know, we're at a draw. Okay, but of course it's risky when opposition technology is unknown. Right, again, if you're sneaking on a Chinese military base, do they have IR? Probably. You know, do you want to use techniques like partial obscurement and assume that they're looking at you with the naked eye? No, bad strategy, right? But if you know, you're trying to sneak out of you know, you were captured in a regular average civilian home and you're trying to sneak out, you know, and you're sneaking through the bushes, you know, does the random kidnapper have IR? Probably not, you know. However, I was able to get some high resolution night vision, which I'll cover a little bit later, cameras online on Amazon for $20. So high resolution cameras with night vision and audio, and I think there are even options for IR are becoming more available. So, you know, this technology is getting cheaper over time. That's just how technology works. So more and more people, civilians, do have access to IR and do have access to high resolution cameras. So you do want to be aware of that. So, you know, if you see a camera nowadays, there's no guarantee it doesn't have IR. So you might, again, you want to have full obscurement for cameras in general, but just be aware that technology like IR is becoming more commonly available. So more people may have it. Like cartels definitely have the money and resources for IR. They definitely have police, you know, anybody with a drone probably has IR on it, right? So if there's a drone, definitely has infrared vision on it. So just be aware that that technology is more common and you may have to employ tactics to counteract it more often. Okay, so let's talk about noticing. So the next step in sensory processing sight for today is noticing. The stimuli stands out to the party seeing it, but they haven't identified it yet and will likely investigate it further, right? So again, if somebody sees a shaking bush, right, in the distance, you're gonna notice that, right? I'm on patrol, I'm looking at all the bushes, one's moving, I'm gonna notice that. Now, again, it's not identified. Could that be a person? Could it be an animal? You know, I'm not gonna call in and say, hey, there's a shaking bush, it's an intruder, right? That's how I get fired, right? I'm gonna have to investigate. So the method to avoid being noticed while being seen is called ambient contrast. So there's a lot of factors to this, but just digging into it, it really all falls into ambient, what I call ambient contrast. So ambient contrast, so the term ambience or ambient refers to the general environment that applies to sight, hearing, probably touch, all of that. Just ambience is just a general environment. And then of course contrast, right? How things stand out in comparison to one another, right? So ambient contrast is how an entity appears visually today relative to their environment based on several factors, including light level. So we're going to talk about dilation ratio first. This is a big one. So a lot of people say, right, you're sneaking around. What do they say? They stick to the shadows, right? You want to be in the shadows. Why do you want to be in the shadows, though, right? Why specifically do you want to be in the shadows, right? There's less light there, less opportunity to be seen, right? But we talk about contrast, right? It's not about necessarily being in the lower light. It's about being in the lower light than your opponent, right? Because our pupils dilate and constrict, right? So when you're in the dark, your pupils dilate so they can absorb more light and they adjust to the darkness, right? And it makes seeing things that are in the light, as long as it's not a super intense bright light, but seeing things in the distance that are in the light, or just in like a street light, it makes it really easy, right? Because your pupils are dilated and you can absorb more light and see better. Now the person standing in that light, their pupils are constricted to protect them from the light, but that makes seeing into the dark harder, right? So it's less important to be in the shadows, but it's more important to be in a lower light level than your opponent. Now obviously we have things like night vision goggles, which kind of ruin that, right? If you're both in low light, right, the person with the night vision goggles can see clear as day. Now, but it also enhances it, right? If they're in a bright light and they have night vision goggles, they're basically completely blind, right? So the night vision goggles enhance the light level around them. I don't know the exact science behind it, but yeah, with night vision goggles, if you're standing in a low light area, it enhances the light. But again, right, you step into the even a dim light, you're gonna go blind, like basically be blind through the night vision goggles. Shouldn't damage your eyes too much, but the point being is, right, that gives you super night vision basically. We already have night vision by our dilated pupils, but you can use night vision goggles to enhance that. But going back to the naked eye, right, it's more important to be, even if I'm standing in the light, you're standing in a super bright light, you still can't see me, right, or you can't notice me. You're looking in my direction, the light from my body is traveling into your eyes, even if you're looking into the darkness, it's just you can't notice it. Right? It's so dark, everything blends in because you can't absorb enough light to identify what's in the dark. They blend in. But technically, the light is still coming off the body to some degree, and it's still technically traveling into the eyes. That's why this falls under noticing. But the point of the dilation ratio is it's not just important to be in the shadows, because if you're in the shadows and your opponent's in the shadows, the playing field is level. Some people have really bad night vision, some people have really good night vision, but effectively the playing field is level. So don't think that just because you're in the shadows, you're invisible, right? If your opponent is also in the shadows, it's an equal playing field. They can see you just as well as you can see them, right? But again, if you're in the shadows and they're in the light, or you're in less light than they are, they're gonna have a harder time seeing you. So just be aware that yes, it's more important to be in a darker setting than your opponent than it is to just be in the dark. If that makes sense. And of course, backlighting, right? You're in the middle of a dark field, so you're in very low light, right? But there's a huge Amazon warehouse behind you, but like it's half a mile away, right? But it's got bright lights on the side of the walls, right? If the Amazon warehouse is over here and I'm here in the middle of a mile-long field and the person looking for me is over there, right? They're gonna see my dark silhouette against the back of that warehouse for like clear as day, right? It's gonna be super obvious. Now they're not gonna be able to identify that it's me, but a human-like silhouette against that dark warehouse is gonna be obvious. Even though I'm in the dark and the light is way the hell over there, right? Even if they're in the light over there, right? They're still gonna see that silhouette contrast, right? So it's just something to be aware about your backlight, right? Is that if there's bright lights behind you, somebody who's in front of you can see it, right? So if I know my enemy's over here, do I want to sneak this way and get backlit, or do I want to go around that way? So it's to be aware of the backlight, right? But it's also, let's say you have the enemy's here, there's a dark row of trees here, there's a light here, and there's a dark row of trees here, right? You'd think, well, if I take this dark row of trees, I'm in the shadows, it's a closer path to the enemy, right? But again, if they look this way, they're gonna see my silhouette against that light on that path. So if I go on the other side, I have another problem, right? If I go on the other side of a row of trees, it goes, well, right, what do I talk about before, right? I've got the obscurity, right? Is that if I'm trying to look through that light at them, right, my pupils constrict, I can't see on the other side of that light very well, and they can't see on the other side of the light very well either. So now we're at a stalemate, right? So here, however, one way you want to counter backlighting, it's not always going to work, right? But if you crawl against the ground, because again, right, I'm 6 feet tall. So even if I'm, at any, right, if I'm looking over here, there's always going to be this kind of downward angle, right, to my vision, right? Because I'm not, I'm always looking down at the ground, right? So if they crawl low on the ground, it decreases the chances of me seeing them. Like obviously, if I'm on the floor and I'm seeing level with the ground, yeah, I'm still going to see them as they're crawling. So a good counter to backlighting is to crawl. So if I'm in that situation where I know that row of lights is right there, right? Yeah, if I sneak up on this tree line and I'm crawling, I can see this guy clear as day. He can't see me at all, right? Or he can't, again, notice me, right? He can still technically see my outline in the dark. There's light traveling off of it, but they can't notice it, right? So that's the good counter to backlighting is if you're low to the ground, if there's no, obviously you want to avoid having backlighting, but if there's no way to avoid it, you want to be low to the ground, crawling. That way, since they're, everybody's vision of the ground is angled down, there's a lower chance of them noticing. Colors and texture, which is basically just covered in the term camouflage. So you're in a similar light level, right? Is there any way to avoid, being noticed? Yes, right? If you look very similar to the background, right? We talk about the bush, right? If I'm standing behind that bush and I'm wearing bright white, clothing, again, if it's only a few specks here and there, they probably won't see it. But let's say it's a thin bush, but I'm wearing a ghillie suit, right? Well, if I'm wearing a ghillie suit, I look exactly like that bush, right? I've got the right texture, the right color. I blend right in, right? You can see me in my ghillie suit. Or if you've seen one of those pictures online, they say, right, where's whatever, right? If you scan the entire picture, or like where's Waldo, if you're familiar with that, right? You scan the entire picture, you saw what you were looking for the first time, right? It just takes a few times for you to notice it. You get what I'm saying? Your eyes passed right over it and absorbed the light, but you just didn't notice it. So again, camouflage, using similar colors or textures to your background or your immediate ambience is, another method you can use to avoid being noticed while being seen. Motion. Now, I was going to make motion its own separate category, right? Because our eyes have cones in the center, which are good for detailed vision and color vision, but we're surrounded, and I think it's 70% of our eyes are rods, which are specifically designed to see movement, right? So generally, if you move, you pretty much get noticed immediately, right? So I was going to put motion as its own thing. However, we notice contrast, right? If there's a crowd of 90 people walking in one direction and one person not moving, just standing there in the center, do you notice them? You absolutely notice them, right? So it's the contrast, or same thing, you're in a crowd, everybody's moving, but one person is sprinting, right? You notice it. So again, in general, yes, most of the time, right, if you're just in an environment with some bushes and some stuff like that, you don't want to move, right? Because they're gonna, right, if a squirrel jumps between the trees, right, your enemy's gonna look up and notice the motion, right? And if you're holding still, they're gonna pass right over you. But if everything around your environment is, right, your ambience is moving, you wanna be moving at a similar speed, right? So you're not noticed, right? But if you're in a crowd, right, and you're right, camouflage, you're wearing similar clothing to everybody else, your color and texture scheme looks the same, and you've got a good, or which is also disguise, which I'll talk about later, right? But again, your motion is consistent. You're moving the same speed as everybody else with the same mannerisms. Super hard to notice you in that crowd. So yes, a majority of the time you want to avoid motion because that's what our eyes are predominantly designed to detect. But again, in an environment where there is motion, you want to move in the similar speed and similar pattern of that motion so you don't stand out. Because if you're still in a moving environment, you're going to stand out just like you would if you move in a still environment. And then distance and scaling. So I put these in the same point, right, with scaling, right? It's just very simple. Again, going back to common sense, the larger you are, the easier you are to notice, right? Have you ever seen a 7-footer in a crowd and not noticed them? Of course not, right? Or vice versa. If there's 50 people lined up, all between 5'2" and 6'2", but there's one 4-foot person there, you're right, they're different. They're gonna stand out, So again, the larger you are, it's harder for you to hide your effective body. But also, again, if you're really tiny, you stand out. So you just don't want to stand out in general. But again, the further away you are, the smaller you appear, but more importantly, the less details the person seeing you has, right? So all of these, the thresholds raise, right? The light level when you're a mile away, again, it's got to be huge for them to tell a difference, right? We talk about colors and texture, right? or again with backlighting, right? The further away you are, the harder it is to tell distance, or the harder it is to tell what that is being backlit. Colors and textures, right? Really hard to tell textures from a distance. Not as hard to see colors, right? But motion, you know what I mean, right? You have to be moving really fast at a distance for people to really notice it. So just the further away you are, the smaller you appear, the more you have to move to be noticed, right? The worse your camouflage can be, the light level difference. Again, it enhances, right? If they're standing in the light and their pupils are constricted, they're gonna have a harder time absorbing that light from further away, right? So just when you're at a distance, you're smaller, you're harder to see, all of that. It's just harder for people to notice you the further away you are. But again, you appear smaller, less details, but also right up close in person, you don't want to be large, right? So again, going back to getting on the ground, right? If I'm laying on the ground, only a smaller section of my body is the light's going into their eyes for them to see and notice, or if I'm standing all the way tall, right, from my head to my toes, it's going into your eyes, right? So again, you want to try and make yourself small by distance or by, compacting your body close up. Okay, let's talk about identifying. So identifying is the final step in sensory processing. Once you've been seen, noticed, and identified, you've been detected. The method of avoiding being identified after being seen and noticed is disguise, pretty much hiding in plain sight. So again, you've been seen, you've been noticed, but the last way to not be identified as an enemy is to basically look like you belong there. There's various methods. The key to a good disguise is to be complete. The smallest details matter the most. So I'm gonna cross over into other senses here, right? But let's say I'm trying to, some people have said that I look, there's people that said that I look like I'm of Indian or Middle Eastern descent, right? So let's say I'm trying to fake like I'm, from I'm a citizen of Saudi Arabia, right? Yes, I can wear the outfit they wear and talk the language and wear the hair and all that, right? But it's gonna be the small details that get me caught up, right? Like if I know Farsi generally, but I don't know specific memes and trends from that region, you know what I mean? That's what's gonna get me caught up. I look the right way, but when you're talking right, my mannerisms aren't right, the way I say something isn't right, the way I shake a hand or wave, it's just not right? Like if I was trying to impersonate a soldier, right? Again, if I have the uniform and the haircut and everything, the boots and all that perfect, but the way I salute is off, the way I stand, maybe, right, etc. I'm standing like this, but they all stand like that, right? They're gonna be looking at me like, your mannerisms aren't right, or it's the opposite. If I was walking around without a uniform, but all my mannerisms are right, or I'm walking around with a uniform and I'm wearing Crocs, right, but my mannerisms are right. I stand the right way, I talk the right way, I have all the small details down, I can pass as a soldier at a regulation, whereas the opposite, I've got all the regulations perfectly, but I just don't talk and I just don't have the mannerisms down, I don't have the gait right, I look funny, you know what I'm saying? That's going to give me away. So same thing with visual stuff, right? Wearing the right uniform, right? We go back to the crowd situation, right? Dressing like everybody else in the crowd is right? But if I'm walking faster than everybody else, right? I'm looking around suspicious, you know what I mean? Or I'm power walking while everybody else is just kind of casual walking, right? That gait is what's going to get people suspicious, right? To where if I'm wearing, everybody's wearing Mardi Gras uniforms and I'm wearing just jeans and a t-shirt, right? But I'm acting normal, I'm walking the right way, I'm looking like I belong, I've got the right mannerisms, even though I'm not dressed the same as everybody else, I still just look like a regular guy. So it's just important to remember that whether it's, again, any of the senses, right? It's smelling the right way, looking the right way, sounding the right way, anything with the disguise is the smallest details are the most important. It's not always about having the right overt things. Those are important, but it's about having the small details that are really good for not being identified. Okay, so takeaways and conclusions, my favorite part of the lecture. So visual stealth is more about dominating visual processing than avoiding being seen. So again, I've covered that throughout the lecture, right? The myth of the the shadows, right? You know, you don't necessarily want to be in the shadows. It's just important to be in a lower light level than your opponent, right? Or again, we talk about obscurement, right? You don't want to just hide behind something and not be seen. It's important to maintain good vision on the person you're hiding from, you know, and it's better to have some parts of you exposed to have perfect vision on them than to, right, hide and now you can't see them and they can't see you and we're in a guessing game, right? Like if you're hiding in a, you know, barrel that has no holes in it, right? And the person looking for you has a dog, well, you know, you're not going to know that they have a dog until you can hear the dog. When you can hear the dog, they're going to be close enough to have your scent, right? You try to pop out of that barrel, you're going to be seen and detected. Or if you're hiding in, you know, a crate that has slits and you're looking and from 100 yards away or 150 yards away, you can see that dog, you have time to be like, oh shit, let me get out of here and keep running, and you have a chance, right? So again, it's more about dominating the sensory processing than just, you know, I don't want to be seen. You have to maintain the sight on them and you have to dominate them. Okay, know the difference between detection and deterrence. So this is a very important one for practical self-defense. So most people, most self-defense instructors will tell you what? Stay in a well-lit area, right? That's what they tell you for safety. Now, the problem with that, obviously, that has nothing to do with detection. It has everything to do with deterrence, right? The thought process behind that is that if you're in a well-lit area, right, cameras can see what happened clearly and witnesses can see what happened clearly. Or if they're not wearing a mask, you can see their face more clearly, right? But if there's no cameras, there's no witnesses, and they either have a mask or, if we're going to be grim, they don't plan on letting you live to tell the tale, that well-lit area is no longer a deterrence. It's there, right? There's no reason, so they'll come out of the bushes. And obviously, where we talked about it with the dilation ratio, being in a well-lit area gives them everything they need to know to detect you, right? You can't see into the bushes very well. They can see you clear as day. So when you're standing in a well-lit area, you're giving the perpetrator in the bushes perfect information, right? You are letting them dominate sensory processing. They know exactly where you are. They can see every detail. They can see what kind of dog you're walking with. They can see how tall you are. They can see your face. They can, you know, read your pants. Like, they have perfect visual information on you, and you can't even, right? Your pupils are constricted. You can't even see into the bushes. So again, if they're not deterred, standing in that well-lit area is not going to do anything for you, okay? Now, let's say there's a well-lit path, there's bushes over here you're concerned about, but there's an open field over here, right? Going back to what we talked about, the safest place, if we're talking from a pure detection standpoint, is actually walk in the middle of that dark field, right? That sounds scary, but again, right, we talked about it. They're sitting in the bushes, right? They're trying to look at you through that well-lit path, right? It's going to constrict their pupils. They're not going to be able to see you very well in the field. They're only really going to be able to see your, we talk about backlighting, right? If there's houses or street lights behind you, they're going to be able to see your silhouette, right? But if you're a girl wearing a hoodie, you know what I'm saying? And a creepy dude in the bushes is looking at you from 100 feet away and they see a silhouette of a hoodie, you know, do they know that that's a girl? Do they know that that's who they're looking for, right? They don't really have good visual information, right? So to avoid detection in the absence of deterrence, like if it's 3 in the morning and there's nobody out and there's no cameras on that bike path, and you walk in that well-lit area, like I said, you're giving your enemy all of the visual processing information they need. And if there's, you know, there's no deterrence there, and again, you're closer to the bushes, it's harder for them to get you. If you're in the middle of the field and they somehow see you from the bushes, right, you're going to notice the bushes moving, and then you're going to see them charging at you 100 feet away. It's terrifying, right? But you've got 100 feet to act. You've got 100 feet to reach for a weapon. You've got 100 feet to call 911. You've got 100 feet to run, right? So again, from a detection standpoint, you actually do want to be in the middle of that field where your eyes have adjusted so you have good night vision. You can see your entire surroundings. And again, you can see clear as day onto that well-lit path. And if there's some bushes on the other side of the path, right, there's kind of that obscurement between you. They can't see past that bright light out of the bushes. You can't see them in the bushes, so they can't see you, they can't detect you, and you have good vision all around you. So again, I'm not saying staying in a well-lit area is a bad idea. I'm just saying there's more to it than that. Is don't just hear some tactical advice and just take it because that's what you're person with the commander's tone and the nice uniform and the medals told you. Break it down scientifically, right? Weigh your options, right? Yes, if it's 7 p.m. and there's tons of people around and lots of witnesses, deterrence is great, but like I said, you're walking at 1:30 a.m., there's no witnesses around, you're on a path that has no cameras, right? Walking in the shadows will stop that creep from detecting you. Or if the creeps are waiting in the well-lit area, right, you can see them long before they see you, or even if you're walking in the bushes yourself, right? Now that night vision is equal. Now you're both kind of predators, if I want to be corny about it. But yeah, just know the difference between deterrence and detection when it comes to visual stimuli. And then make a proper tactical decision based on the totality of the circumstances. And then, of course, diversify your detection methods. I'm tired. I'm almost done with this lecture, right? So again, Anarchy Arts, offense and defense, right? Even if you're the guards looking to catch the intruder, right? This lecture still applies to you, right? You don't want to just have all your guards out overt and obvious. You might want to have some that are camouflaged, sitting in a ghillie suit on the top of a hill, that anybody casing the joint or trying to sneak in doesn't see, right? You're going to want some that are doing their patrols without lights, using their night vision. Like when I've done security patrols, I've done it on a farm, I've done it without a light, right? I've just used my night vision because I can see out into the field pretty well. And again, when I was walking near the dark fence in a dark uniform, you can't see me against the fence very well. So I was actually dominating the sensory processing while walking without a flashlight, right? But when I have a flashlight, now I'm losing it, right? I'm giving my position away clear as day. And if I'm staring at the beam of the flashlight, my pupils constrict, I can't see what's out there. And so I'm losing the sensory battle. So again, or going back to the group of friends, right? They say, right, travel in safety in numbers. If there's 5 of you, right, the current conventional wisdom is all 5 of you stay on the well-lit path in a tight group. Again, great for deterrence, terrible for detection. None of you can see into the bushes. None of you can see into that dark field very well. So maybe you have one person 10 feet out here in the dark field so that they have good night vision and they can make sure nobody's approaching your group from the field. You may have one person kind of in the bushes area, it's like clean bushes, if there's like a path behind the bushes, you walk past there and check past there, make sure there's nobody lurking, right? Or again, right, if you've got good night vision, you're gonna see that creep in the bushes, way before they think you see them. You know what I'm saying? So they think, they're invisible to the 2 people walking on the path, but you've caught them by surprise. So just good to like I said, diversify your detection methods. Have people, that are in different levels of light so that they can see everything. Have people, some people uniformed and avert the sea, but have some people camouflaged. Having some people disguised would be a little crazy. But the point being is, yeah, diversify your detection methods. Don't just stick to a small, narrow group of habits. But that's pretty much just general advice for life in general. And finally, the presentation is done.